In 2017, the movie Jungle, based on Yossi Ginsberg's 1981 journey into the Amazon rainforest, was released. It was directed by Greg McLean and starred Daniel Radcliffe of Harry Potter fame as Ginsberg. The film was based on Yossi's 2006 book Jungle, a harrowing true story of adventure, danger, and survival. The true story behind the film is shocking and heroic, which left 2 men surviving a terrible ordeal and 2 others lost in the Bolivian rainforest forever, vanished with no trace for 40 years. As Yossi himself said, quote, "I have to tell you, usually movies are bigger than life. This movie is smaller than life. Everything you see is on a smaller scale than what really happened." In November 1981, Yossi Ginsberg, 22, had just finished his military training at the Israeli Defense Forces IDF and had served 3 years in the Navy. He wanted to explore the world. Quote, "I wanted an adventure. I was naive, bright-eyed. Everything is possible," end quote. Yossi had been inspired by the book Papillon by Henry Charrière. Charrière was a French writer, convicted as a murderer by the French courts, who always denied his guilt. He wrote the novel A Memoir of his incarceration in the escape from a penal colony in French Guiana on Devil's Island. While Charrière claimed that Papillon was largely true, modern researchers believe that much of the book's material came from other inmates rather than Charrière himself. In the 1970s, Yossi became determined to find Charrière and asked for his blessing to follow in his footsteps by traveling to the Amazon rainforest. Ginsberg had briefly returned from an Africa to Mexico trip, and he worked several jobs to save the money to travel to South America. But by the time Ginsberg was finally able to travel, Charrière had passed away on the 29th of July, 1973, and the tribes Ginsberg was interested in discovering had been civilized. In late 1981, Ginsberg hitchhiked from Venezuela to Colombia and then to Bolivia. There he met Marcus Stam from Schaffhausen in Switzerland, and the pair became good friends. Marcus was a primary school teacher in Dorflinken, and Yossi and Marcus traveled together to La Paz in Bolivia. At 3,650 meters, 11,975 feet above sea level, La Paz is the highest capital city in the world. There, Yossi and Marcus met Karl Repreter, an Austrian, who claimed to be a geologist. Karl told Yossi that he was planning an expedition into the uncharted Amazon in Bolivia in search of gold in remote indigenous Tacana village. Repreter told stories about having visited an ancient indigenous village hidden deep within the Bolivian rainforest, inhabited by an indigenous tribe who had seen few white men in their lifetime, and tantalizing stories of gold and riches. Yossi also persuaded Kevin Gale, an American photographer from Oregon they had met on their travels, to also join them on the trip. Kevin was about to fly back to the U.S. to spend Thanksgiving with his parents, but decided to return for Christmas instead. Ginsberg, Gale, and Stam followed Repreter by plane to Apolo, La Paz, and from there traveled down to the Chochi River, and then to a village called Asariamas, at the confluence of rivers Tochi, Asariamas. Then the group began traveling up the Asariamas River, across the mountains, on their way to Repreter's fabled destination with promises of gold. After packing some supplies in their backpacks, the 4 men headed deep into the Bolivian jungle. They headed away from civilization, with Karl leading the way. There was animal life everywhere around them, including birds, monkeys, spiders, snakes, and insects. Karl told them they wouldn't carry food apart from rice, beans, and salt, and they would kill wild animals in the jungle to survive. Yossi said of Karl when he killed a monkey, quote, "It was gruesome. You could see the wilderness in his eyes. Things start to go wrong, and the group separates. They trek for several days and begin to run out of food, as Yossi, Marcus, and Kevin expected to be at their destination within a few days. Eventually, low on supplies, they had to eat monkeys. Stam refused to eat them and inevitably grew physically weaker, and he had gotten trench foot, a fungal infection, so he couldn't keep up with the rest of the men. After a week, he said he was in a tremendous pain, but the others didn't believe him, as he was always complaining. Yossi said, quote, "We were constantly hungry. We would walk long days having eaten nothing at all. We shot at monkeys and ate them. I would have put anything in my mouth. If you'd offered me human flesh, I wouldn't have refused to indulge. When you get that hungry, nothing is disgusting." End quote. The four men decided to abandon their journey and return to Asariamas, as Marcus was adamant he was unable to walk any further. They had headed back to the Tochi River. Kevin and Yossi were extremely upset with Marcus, as their dream had been shattered, and blamed his unwillingness to eat the wildness as a cause of their problems. When the four men arrived back at the village of Asariamas, Carl told them about his new plan to raft down the Tochi River to a small gold quarry called Koriplea on the river bed, and from there downriver to Roranbake near the Beni River, and then return to La Paz. With the villagers' help, they built the raft and headed downriver, and arrived at the confluence of the rivers Tochi and Iparama. There Carl Repeater told them about the rapids in San Pedro Canyon, which were unsuitable to pass through using a raft. He also told the others he could not swim and refused to continue on the water. Yossi said, quote, "On the raft, Carl argued with the others, even though he didn't know anything about rafting. There was no cooperation, no friendship. It was hell," end quote. So Kevin Gale and Yossi Ginsberg decided to continue rafting downriver to Rurenbake, with Carl Repeater and Marcus Stamm planned to walk up the Iparama River to Iparama village near the river's source and return from there to Apollo. The four men agreed to meet before Christmas in La Paz. Carl said if the others wanted to live, they should walk. But Kevin was adamant they should continue with their plan and walk around the San Pedro Falls, build a new raft, and then continue their journey down the river. Yossi wanted to go with Carl and Marcus, but Yossi had built a relationship with Kevin, and he decided to join him on the raft. Yossi was concerned as he wanted the group to come out together, and Marcus was upset to be left behind with Carl on foot. In hindsight, it was a crazy decision to split the group in the jungle. It would theoretically take Carl and Marcus a week to walk out, but they were never seen again. As Kevin and Yossi neared the waterfall in the San Pedro Canyon on the raft, they lost control in a series of raging rapids and became separated. The river was narrow and fast-flowing. The two men lay down on the raft as they hit the white water, and then they collided with a large rock. They were then thrown into the water. Gale made it to the bank safely, but Ginsberg floated down the river and over the waterfall. Yossi fought hard and kept afloat until the waters had calmed down. He then swam to shore only to realize he was all alone, hungry and exhausted and scared. Fortunately, he found the pack with some essential supplies, which would later be crucial in keeping him alive in the jungle. Kevin was rescued by local fishermen after having been stranded for 5 days floating on a log in the river and returned to La Paz. He visited the Israeli and Austrian consulates to request their help preparing rescue missions for the missing men. He was told by the authorities at the Austrian consulate that Repeater was actually a criminal wanted by Interpol. He was no geologist. Yossi spent the next 3 weeks lost without supplies or equipment. He quickly ran out of rice, but occasionally found berries and fruits in the forest, foraged for eggs from nests, and even waited for a monkey to fall so he could eat it. He faced attacks from wild boar and constant threats of poisonous snakes, termite bites, and on his 6th night, alone in the jungle, a hungry jaguar. Yossi said, quote, "The nights without a doubt were the worst of all. As darkness descends, there is no light whatsoever. The canopy swallows the stars, and the moon in the darkness is as thick as velvet. At night, all the noises emerge. The screeches and the roars and the barks and the calls, and things are moving around. It was simply overwhelming. I had no fire or gun to protect myself. If not for my ability to daydream, I would have consumed myself during these nights of horror." End quote. One night, Yossi had been asleep when he was awoken by rustling and woke up face to face with a jaguar. He grabbed a can of mosquito repellent and a lighter and improvised a flamethrower. Yossi said, quote, "I learnt the trick from a James Bond movie." End quote. This was Roger Moore as 007 in Live and Let Die, killing a snake that was placed in his hotel room to kill him. But the worst experience of all, as he hiked day after day in what he hoped was the direction of the nearest settlement, was the flesh and skin tearing from his feet. They became so infected that soon he had no skin left on his soles, leaving nothing but bloody fleshy stumps. He said, quote, "They were just chunks of exposed flesh. I couldn't take the pain. I dragged myself to a tree full of fire ants and shook it on my head. The waves of pain and adrenaline distracted me from my feet." End quote. He also discovered worms embedded under his skin and impaled in his rectum on a broken stick after sliding down a mud slope. One morning, Yossi woke up with aches and pains all over his body, only to realize he had spent the night on a termite nest. On the 17th day of his ordeal, a plane flew overhead, but they did not see him. The canopy of the jungle means that anyone on the ground is impossible to see, he recalled. Quote, "When the plane passed, it just broke me, and the surge of hope was the worst thing that happened to me." End quote. Yossi was sobbing in the mud, contemplating suicide, when he looked up and seemed to see a girl. Quote, "For 2 days, I had the company of a girl. She appeared next to me. It was no less of a miracle if it was my imagination that had summoned her up, because it happened at the very moment I had broken down and given up. She appeared in the worst moment when I really gave up. I talked to her all the time, but she didn't talk back. I built a camp for us both and made a space for her to sleep next to me." End quote. But then one night the girl vanished. Quote, "I was trying to hug her, and I realized there was nobody there. I freaked out because if she's not there, it means I'm crazy. I thought I'd lost my sanity. I was very scared. I don't know exactly how to explain it. Maybe my subconscious pulled me out of it." End quote. Yossi believed that the girl saved his life because she needed him. Quote, "That's something very deep about human nature. We'll do more to save someone else's life than our own, because I couldn't help myself anymore. I felt it was over, but the moment she was there, suddenly I had responsibility." End quote. Yossi also nearly drowned twice after the worst storm in a decade hit the area. He said, quote, "The second swamp I fell in, I couldn't pull myself out. I was thinking of committing suicide, but then I thought that if I was going to kill myself, I should have done it in the first couple of days. After 19 days of struggle, there was no way I was dying then." End quote. Yossi was rescued the next day, after nearly 3 weeks, barely clinging on to life. Upon hearing the sound of an engine, Yossi made his way back to the nearby river and amazingly bumped into Kevin, who was with indigenous people who had organized a search and rescue mission led by Abelardo Tico Tudela. They found Ginsberg 3 days into their search. 3 weeks after, he was first declared missing and close to the search being abandoned. He spent the 3 months following his rescue recovering in hospital. Repeater and Stam were never seen or heard from again. Despite attempts by several search and rescue missions involving Kevin and Yossi, they were never found, and there was no sign of any campfires, human waste, or evidence of animals being killed or vegetation being disturbed. Marcus, mother in Switzerland, believed the story from the spiritualists that he was living in Peru, and Yossi agreed to try and locate him there with no success. None of the communities in the area had ever seen a gringo living there. They completely vanished into the jungle. What happened to the 2 men remains a mystery. Did Repeater leave Stam to his fate given his trench foot and then get lost himself? Or as a criminal, did he just vanish into the Bolivian jungle or further afield in Latin America? Yossi said in his book he thought they may have been killed by a falling tree in a storm, or that Repeater had succumbed to an accident and both men had died, as Marcus would have been unable to get out of the jungle unaided.